My father left me his company instead of my brother. Then I found out why he wanted it so badly. My father died believing my brother would inherit his company. At least, that's what everyone in my family believed. 3 days after the funeral, the lawyer read the will and left the company to me instead. My brother didn't speak to me for 6 months, and when he finally did, he asked me one question that made me realize the inheritance had never been about money. My name is Clara Bennett, I'm 32, and until last year I had a pretty ordinary relationship with my family. My father, Richard, owned a small commercial landscaping company called Greenlane Grounds. It wasn't some massive corporation. We had about 30 employees, a warehouse, several trucks, and contracts with businesses, apartment complexes, and a few local municipalities. But my dad had built it from nothing. He started with a used pickup truck and a lawn mower when he was 24. By the time he died, the company was worth considerably more than I had ever realized. My older brother, Daniel, was 36. He had worked for Dad since he was 21. I hadn't. I had gone to university, moved to another city and worked in marketing. So when my father died unexpectedly, everyone assumed Daniel would take over Greenlane. Including me. I actually remember telling him that at the funeral. I said Dad would want you to keep it running. Daniel just nodded. He looked exhausted. At the time, I thought he was grieving. Now I realize he was terrified. My father died on a Tuesday. He'd been complaining about feeling tired for a few weeks, but he refused to see a doctor. My mother had passed away years earlier, so it was just the three of us. Dad, Daniel, and me. There were no other siblings. The three of us had never been especially close, but we weren't estranged either. Daniel and Dad were the ones who spent most of their time together. They played golf. They went fishing. They worked together. They talked about business. I was the odd one out. Dad used to joke that Daniel was his right hand and I was his left. I never took it personally. When Dad died, I assumed his company would naturally go to Daniel. I didn't want it anyway. I had no idea how to run a landscaping company. I couldn't tell a zero-turn mower from a riding mower. I didn't know which employees managed which crews. I didn't know which contracts were profitable. Daniel knew all of that. So when the funeral ended, I expected the next few months to be straightforward. Grieve. Sort through Dad's belongings. Let Daniel take over the company. Move on. I was wrong. The lawyer's office was on a Thursday morning. There were 4 of us. Me, Daniel, our Aunt Margaret, and Dad's attorney, Samuel Price. Daniel arrived 10 minutes late. He looked terrible. His eyes were red. His shirt was wrinkled. He sat across from me and didn't say anything. Samuel opened a folder. "I'll keep this as brief as possible," he said. Nobody responded. He began reading the will. Dad left small amounts of money to several relatives. A few pieces of jewelry went to Aunt Margaret. His fishing boat went to Daniel. His personal vehicles went to Daniel. His house was divided between us. Then Samuel paused. I remember looking up. He looked directly at me. The controlling interest in Greenlane Grounds LLC is to be transferred to Clara Bennett. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I thought I'd heard him wrong. Sorry. Samuel repeated it. Daniel didn't move. I looked at him. He was staring at the table. That's not right, I said. Samuel said, I've reviewed the document several times. No, I mean, Dad wouldn't do that. Daniel finally looked at me. His face was completely expressionless. I said Daniel has worked there for 15 years. Nobody answered. Then Samuel continued. The will also states that Clara is to retain ownership for a minimum of 3 years, before deciding whether to sell or transfer any portion of the company. That's when Daniel stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just said, Congratulations. Then he walked out. I followed him into the parking lot. Daniel. He kept walking. Daniel, wait. He turned around. For the first time since Dad died, I saw genuine anger on his face. You got what you wanted. I stared at him. What does that mean? He laughed. You always thought Dad loved you more. What? Forget it. He got into his truck. I stood there watching him leave. I didn't understand what had just happened. But that was the first moment I realized something was seriously wrong. That evening I called Aunt Margaret. She was furious. Not at Daniel. At me. She said your father made a terrible mistake. I asked her what she meant. She said you don't know anything about that company. I know. Then sell it. I haven't even decided whether I want it. You need to. I asked why. She wouldn't answer. Instead she said, your brother built that business. I reminded her that Dad had built it. She said, your brother kept it alive. Then she hung up. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the will. Why me? Why would Dad give me something he knew I couldn't operate? The next morning, I found an envelope in my apartment mailbox. There was no stamp. No return address. My name was handwritten on the front. Inside was one sentence. Ask Daniel about the Northbridge account. I read it 3 times. I had no idea what the Northbridge account was. The next morning I went to Greenline. The office was inside the warehouse. It smelled like fertilizer, diesel and wet soil. I hadn't been there in years. People stared at me when I walked in. One of the office managers, Lena, recognized me. Clara. I nodded. She hugged me. Then she pulled back awkwardly. So, you're the owner now? I guess. She looked uncomfortable. Daniel isn't here. I know. I asked about the Northbridge account. Her expression changed immediately. What about it? I don't know, someone told me to ask Daniel about it. She looked around. Then lowered her voice. Who told you? I don't know. She stared at me. Finally she said, you should talk to your father's accountant. Why? She hesitated. Because Northbridge is the reason your father and Daniel stopped getting along. I froze. They stopped getting along. She looked confused. You didn't know? No. She looked genuinely shocked. Clara, your father was planning to fire Daniel. I called Daniel. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. So I drove to his house. He opened the door after the 3rd knock. When he saw me, he sighed. What? I said we need to talk about Northbridge. He stared at me. Then his face went pale. Who told you? I received a note. What note? I handed it to him. He read it. Then he looked at me. Where did you get this? My mailbox. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Did anyone see you get it? I don't know. He looked genuinely frightened. That scared me more than anything else. I said, Daniel, what happened? He rubbed his face. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. You're not supposed to own that company. I stared at him. Apparently Dad thought otherwise. No. He shook his head. I mean you're not supposed to own it because if you do, you're going to find out what I did. I didn't say anything. He looked at the ground. Finally he said, I stole money. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. What? Not from Dad. He swallowed. From the company. I stepped backward. How much? About $180,000. I couldn't speak. He continued. It started 2 years ago. He had been secretly transferring money from one of the company accounts. At first, he used it to pay off gambling debts. Then he tried to win the money back. Instead, the debt grew. He borrowed from one person to pay another. Eventually, he owed nearly $200,000. Dad discovered it. That's when they stopped speaking. But Dad didn't report him. Instead, he gave Daniel a deadline. 6 months. Pay everything back. Daniel promised he would. He couldn't. So Dad began quietly preparing to remove him from the company. But there was another problem. Daniel hadn't just stolen money. He had forged documents. He had altered invoices. He had used company funds to cover the transfers. If the company's auditors discovered everything, Greenline could collapse. And Daniel could potentially go to prison. I looked at him. Why didn't Dad tell me? Daniel laughed bitterly. Because he was protecting you. That sentence stayed with me. Dad had spent his final months preparing everything. The will, the company transfer, the legal documents, the accountants, everything. And I realized something. He hadn't given me Greenline because he thought I could run it. He gave it to me because he wanted me to save it. The 3-year clause suddenly made sense. He didn't want Daniel selling the company. He didn't want Daniel controlling the books. He wanted an independent person to take over. Someone who had no involvement in what happened. Someone he trusted. Me. But there was still one thing I couldn't understand. Why hadn't Dad simply reported Daniel? Daniel answered that question too. Because he was still your father. I looked at him. He said. He kept saying that if he sent me to prison, he'd lose both his children. For the next several weeks, I barely spoke to Daniel. I hired an independent accountant. We audited everything. The numbers were worse than Daniel had admitted. The total missing money was closer to $240,000. There were unpaid taxes, questionable contracts, personal expenses, fake vendor accounts. It took months to untangle. But there was something strange. Every time we found evidence against Daniel, we also found evidence that Dad had already discovered it. He had been documenting everything. He knew. He knew exactly what Daniel had done. And yet he kept working beside him. Eventually, I found the final file. It was labeled, Clara, if you're reading this. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a letter. Dad's handwriting. I read it alone in his old office. It said, Clara, if you are reading this, then I'm gone and you probably hate me. I'm sorry. I know you don't understand why I left Greenline to you. You probably think I ignored Daniel's mistakes because he was my favorite. The truth is the opposite. I gave the company to you because I finally realized protecting Daniel was hurting him more than helping him. I spent years cleaning up his mistakes. Every time I fixed something, I convinced myself I was giving him another chance. But I wasn't giving him another chance. I was teaching him that someone would always save him. I should have stopped years ago. I had to stop reading. I cried. Not because of the company. Because I suddenly understood my father. He wasn't leaving me a business. He was leaving me a responsibility. And maybe an apology. There was another page. This one changed everything. Dad had written, I want you to know something about your brother. Daniel thinks I chose you because I love you more. He is wrong. I chose you because you are the only person in this family who has never needed me to rescue you. That is why I trust you with what I built. I sat there for a long time. Then I noticed something else. A USB drive was taped to the back of the letter. It contained videos. Dad had recorded them during the last month of his life. I watched the first one. He looked tired. much older than I remembered. He said, "If you're watching this, I've probably already given you the company." Then he paused. "There's something I didn't put in the will." I leaned closer to the screen. Dad said, "Daniel didn't steal all of that money for gambling." I froze. He explained that the first transfers were gambling related. But later, Daniel had started using the money to repay someone. Someone who had been threatening him. A man named Victor Hale. Victor had loaned Daniel money at extremely high interest. And Victor wasn't just a private lender. He had been involved with several contractors who had previously tried to take Green Line's municipal contracts. Dad believed Daniel had gotten involved with people who wanted control of the company. The theft had started as Daniel's personal problem. But eventually it had become something bigger. Someone wanted Green Line. I immediately called our accountant. Then our attorney. Then the police. Daniel was furious when he found out. But this time I didn't protect him. Neither did Dad. We turned everything over. It took almost a year before everything was resolved. Daniel wasn't sent to prison. He entered a financial rehabilitation program and agreed to repay what he could. Victor Hale was eventually investigated for unrelated financial crimes. Green Line survived. Barely. I sold part of the company to the senior management team. The rest stayed with me. I still don't know if Dad would have wanted that. But I think he would have understood. Daniel and I didn't speak for almost 6 months. Then one evening I got a text. Just 4 words. "Can we talk?" I almost ignored it. Instead, I agreed. We met at a small diner. He looked different. Thinner, older, but calmer. We sat across from each other for several minutes without talking. Then he said, "I hated you." I nodded. "I know. I thought Dad chose you because you were his favorite." "I know." He looked down. Then he said, "I was wrong." I didn't know what to say. So I asked him, "Why did you finally want to talk?" He smiled sadly. "I found Dad's old fishing box." "What?" There was a note inside. I asked what it said. Daniel looked at me. He wrote, "Your sister isn't taking anything from you. I'm trying to make sure there's something left for both of you." I started crying. Daniel did too. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then he asked, "Do you still hate me?" I thought about it. "No." He nodded. "Good." Then he asked, "Do you hate Dad?" That question hurt more than I expected. Because the truth was complicated. I was angry at Dad. He had kept secrets from me. He had let Daniel's problems grow. He had left me with a company I never asked for. But I also understood him. He had spent years confusing love with protection. And eventually, he realized that protecting someone from consequences isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's the cruelest thing you can do. It's been 3 years now. Green Line still exists. It's smaller, different, but it's healthy. Daniel works there again. Not as the owner. Not as Dad's replacement. He's a crew supervisor. And surprisingly, he's good at it. We aren't the same siblings we were before Dad died. I'm not sure we ever can be. But we're closer than we've been in years. A few months ago, I went through Dad's office one last time. Most of the furniture was gone. The walls were empty. There was almost nothing left. Then I found an old photograph behind a filing cabinet. It was from when we were children. Daniel was about 10. I was 6. Dad was standing between us. Daniel had one arm around my shoulders. I was holding a ridiculously large ice cream cone. On the back, Dad had written, "The whole point was never to decide which child deserved more." Then underneath it, It was to make sure neither of them ended up with nothing. I put the photograph in my wallet. I don't know if Dad made the right decisions. I don't know if leaving me the company was fair. And I definitely don't think keeping Daniel's crimes secret for so long was the right thing to do. But I finally understand why he did it. My father thought he was protecting his son. What he eventually realized was that sometimes the person you keep saving is the person you are preventing from growing. And sometimes the inheritance isn't the house, the money, or the company. Sometimes it's the truth your parents were too afraid to tell you while they were alive.